A grayish-blue two-story house stood in a quiet residential neighborhood in the Boston suburbs. Melissa Watson was brewing coffee in the kitchen while completing her morning routine. The morning sun streamed through the window, reflecting off the marble countertop, making her wedding ring glitter for a moment. "James, hurry up. It's already 8 o'clock, she called toward the stairs. Melissa was a director at a top marketing firm in Boston. Her competence and creativity were well known in the industry, and clients placed great trust in her. With her perfectly styled bob haircut and intellectual aura, she always charmed those around her with her confident demeanor. "I know, I'm coming," James replied as he came down the stairs. He was an investment analyst known for his calculated smile. Dressed in an expensive suit, he appeared to be the model husband at first glance. His career was on the rise, and their combined income was more than sufficient. "Will you be home late today?" Melissa asked as she poured coffee into a mug. "Probably. I have a conference call with a New York client, so I might not finish until after 8. Recently, James had been coming home later and later, and his nighttime phone calls had increased. On the surface, the reason was his busy work schedule. "I see. Well, don't worry about dinner then." As usual, she sighed quietly while quickly preparing toast for breakfast. They used to cook together, enjoying elaborate dinners on weekends. However, lately, James hardly ever set foot in the kitchen. "By the way, Mom is coming today. Remember?" "Oh, Carol. When is she coming again?" James replied somewhat dismissively while checking his smartphone. Melissa's brow furrowed. "This afternoon. I told you I'd pick her up at the airport." Right. He pretended to be indifferent, but seemed somewhat uneasy. Carol was James's mother, a former nurse who had lost her husband early in life. She had lived in Chicago for many years but recently moved to the Boston area. For Melissa, she wasn't just a mother-in-law but a trusted friend. "What time does Mom arrive?" "Around 3. I'm planning to spend the weekend together. Mom said she'll make apple pie for us." Melissa's voice revealed how much she looked forward to spending time with her mother-in-law. Unlike many relationships between daughters and mothers-in-law, Carol and Melissa's was bound by mutual respect and friendship. Recently, they had been spending more time together, shopping on weekends or enjoying gardening. James looked at his watch and stood up. "I have to go. I have a morning meeting with a client." He kissed Melissa on the cheek and headed for the door. The gesture was habitual, lacking genuine affection. As her husband reached for the door, Melissa quietly spoke up. "Is something wrong? You've changed lately." James paused for a moment and turned around. "What are you talking about?" "Nothing's changed." His voice was calm, but his hands trembled slightly. "Really? Late-night phone calls, unexplained expenses, and your attitude. Something's going on, isn't it?" Melissa's sharp intuition sensed that something was happening in their relationship. "You're imagining things. I'm just busy with work." James smiled, but his eyes weren't smiling. "I see." Melissa didn't pursue it further. However, a certain suspicion had begun to grow in her mind. That afternoon, Melissa greeted Carol at the airport. In Carol's warm embrace, she felt the burden on her heart lighten a bit. "What's wrong, Melissa? You seem troubled." Carol's keen observation didn't miss the shadow on Melissa's face. "Mom, I want to talk to you about something later." The two women linked arms and left the airport. That weekend, James came home unusually early. His attitude had completely changed, he was suddenly kind and considerate. "I'd like to make a special dinner tonight." Melissa couldn't hide her surprise at seeing James in the kitchen. It was rare for him to cook. "What's happened?" "Nothing. I just want to show my appreciation to you and Mom." Though Melissa felt something behind his smile, she outwardly expressed joy. Inwardly, however, her wariness of this sudden change grew stronger. "What are you making?" "It's a secret. But it's a special recipe." James smiled meaningfully and took a pot from the kitchen cabinet. At that moment, Melissa's smartphone rang with a message from Carol. "I'll be there soon. We need to talk." Melissa took a deep breath and replied, "I'm waiting. James is making a special dinner." She put her smartphone in her pocket and returned to the kitchen. James was frantically mixing something, and when he noticed her, he quickly hid the ingredients. "Don't ruin the surprise." His voice was gentle, but something lurking in his eyes heightened Melissa's anxiety. Sitting on the living room sofa, Melissa glanced at the clock. 7:15. Carol had arrived 10 minutes ago, put her luggage in the upstairs guest room, and was now sitting next to her. From the kitchen came occasional sounds of a pot being stirred and a knife hitting a cutting board. "It's unusual for James to cook," Carol said in a low voice. Her graying hair was elegantly styled, and her understated navy dress highlighted her dignity. With the sharp observational skills of a former nurse, her blue eyes were fixed on the kitchen door. "Yes, very unusual," Melissa replied while fidgeting with her fingers on her lap. She had briefly told Carol about her suspicions regarding James, the unnatural phone calls, unexplained expenses, and sudden changes in attitude. Carol hadn't said anything, but understanding showed in her eyes. "Here we are," said James as the kitchen door opened. He appeared carrying a large ceramic pot in both hands. Beads of sweat glistened on his forehead, and he looked more tense than usual. After placing the pot on the dining table, he pulled out a chair and motioned for Melissa to sit. "Tonight's special is New England clam chowder. Based on my grandmother's recipe." The steaming creamy white soup released its aroma on the table. Melissa felt a momentary nostalgia for the scent. It reminded her of a seaside restaurant in Cape Cod they had once visited. Memories of happier days returned. "Oh, how lovely." Melissa smiled, but her eyes carefully observed her husband. James also pulled out a chair for Carol, and the three quietly took their seats at the table. "I'm sorry. I've been busy lately and haven't had time to spend with you both," James said as he ladled the soup into large white bowls. His movements were unnaturally careful, as if he feared something. "Especially you, Melissa. I should have cherished you more." He placed a bowl in front of Melissa, then another in front of Carol. Finally, he ladled soup into his own bowl. "Take your time and enjoy." There was a desperate tone in James's words. He picked up his spoon but didn't immediately start eating. Instead, he fixed his gaze on Melissa, watching for her reaction. Melissa took her spoon and stirred the soup. Small chunks of clams appeared and disappeared in the creamy white liquid. She raised the spoon to her lips but stopped at the last moment. The tension on James's face heightened her vigilance. "Mom," Melissa turned to Carol. "I can't finish all this. Would you like some?" Carol looked at Melissa, and as if there was an unspoken understanding between them, she nodded slightly. She happily took up her spoon. "Oh yes, I'd love some." Carol's voice was calm, but her eyes held a cool determination. She dipped her spoon into the soup and slowly lifted it. The steaming liquid dripped slightly from the edge of the spoon. James's expression suddenly changed. The color drained from his face, turning pale. Just as Carol was about to bring the spoon to her mouth, he jumped up from his chair. "Wait, that's..." His voice was almost a scream. A sudden silence fell over the room. Carol slowly lowered her spoon and placed it on the table. Her movements were surprisingly calm. "What is it, James?" Carol's voice was cold as ice. "Why don't you want me to drink it?" At the question, James appeared speechless, his mouth opening and closing. His eyes darted between Melissa and Carol. No, it's just. I added a special spice. He tried to make an excuse, but his voice trembled. What kind of spice? Melissa's question was sharp. She quietly picked up her smartphone from the table. Just a, secret recipe. James answered, backing away. The sweat on his forehead was now flowing like a waterfall. Really? Melissa stood up and operated her smartphone. Then why did you try to poison me? At those words, James's face turned ashen. He tried to say something, but Carol interrupted him. You really are foolish, James. Carol also stood up and stood beside Melissa. There was no longer fear or anxiety on the faces of the two women. There was only a calm determination and a strength assured of victory. We know everything. Melissa's voice was quiet, but the weight of her words was enough to overwhelm James. He collapsed into a chair, covering his face with both hands. How? His voice was hoarse. Your plan was seen through from the beginning. Carol said coldly. In her eyes were mixed the sharp observation skills of a former nurse and the anger of a mother. As silence flowed through the dining room, James's face grew even paler. He stood up and took a step toward the door, but Melissa's cold voice stopped him. Where are you going? We're not finished talking. Melissa picked up her smartphone from the table and displayed a certain photograph. It was a pharmacy prescription with James's name and signature clearly marked. What is this? She turned the smartphone toward him. James's eyes fixed on the photo, and his throat moved spasmodically. Can you explain this to me? That is, well. James was at a loss for words, his gaze swimming to the corner of the room. Carol, looking at the clam chowder on the table, quietly said. Would I die if I drank this soup? Her voice was tinged with deep sadness rather than anger. The expression of a mother who fully understood her son's betrayal. No. That's not. James's words of denial broke off before Carol's cold gaze. Stop lying. As a nurse for 40 years, I've seen various drugs and poisons. What did you put in this soup? Cyanide? Arsenic? Or something stolen from a hospital? Under Carol's sharp questioning, James collapsed into a chair. His will to resist had completely disappeared. We know everything. Melissa said quietly and operated her smartphone again. This time a different image was displayed, a photo of James embracing a blonde woman intimately. Rebecca Clark. Your mistress. Melissa's voice trembled, but it was a tremor of disappointment, not anger. Since when? James remained silent. 1 year ago. 2 years ago. Or even before we were married. 8 months. His voice was faint. 8 months ago. She was the finance director at a new client's company. That's all. I don't love her. Then why? Carol asked. Her voice contained a final effort to understand her son's actions. Melissa showed another document photo. This is the answer. A massive life insurance contract. Melissa's name was clearly listed as the insured, with James Watson as the beneficiary. The insurance amount, $5 million. Contract date, 3 months ago. You sold me for $5 million. Melissa's voice was cold, but tears glistened in her eyes. No, that's not it. James weakly shook his head. Then explain. Why did you try to kill me? I failed in an investment. His voice trembled. I had a huge debt. When I met Rebecca, she suggested a solution. If I killed you, everything would be solved with the insurance money. The confession echoed in the room, followed by a heavy silence. A tear ran down Melissa's cheek. I found everything a month ago. She quietly began to explain. When I borrowed your computer, I accidentally saw your emails. The exchanges with Rebecca. Melissa gave a bitter smile. As a marketing director, I've been trained to pay attention to details. Your change in attitude, unexplained expenses, late-night calls, everything connected. She looked at Carol. That's why I consulted with Mom. Carol nodded and took over the story. As a former nurse, I have knowledge about poisons. I immediately understood what you were planning. She calmly continued. Melissa and I collected evidence every day. Your credit card statements, pharmacy purchase records, and emails with Rebecca. Everything has been submitted to the police. The color drained further from James's face. The police? His voice was contorted with fear. Of course. Melissa pointed outside the window. Red and blue police lights were flashing in front of the house. I reported it 3 weeks ago. Your actions tonight were the final gathering of evidence. She picked up her smartphone and stopped the recording button. Your confession has been recorded too. James stood up with a desperate expression and rushed toward the door. However, at that moment, the door opened, and 2 police officers appeared. James Watson, you are under arrest on suspicion of attempted murder and insurance fraud. One officer announced, and the other handcuffed James's wrists. He had no strength to resist and just stood there in a daze. Rebecca too. She's probably being arrested right now, Melissa answered calmly. As the officers led James away, he looked over his shoulder at Melissa and Carol. His eyes mixed regret and fear. How did you figure it out? The plan was supposed to be perfect. Melissa approached him and quietly whispered in his ear. You forgot one thing, how strong and how clever we women can be. James bowed his head and was led out of the house by the officers. As the door closed, the strength drained from Melissa's shoulders, and she collapsed into Carol's arms. Tears of release from long tension and fear poured out. It's all right now, Carol gently rubbed her back. I can't believe it, that he tried to kill me. Melissa's voice trembled. People sometimes do things we could never imagine. There was deep sadness in Carol's voice. The pain of accepting that her son had tried to become a murderer. How did you know I should check the soup? Melissa looked up at Carol. His behavior told everything. He was too nervous and was watching your reaction. Carol smiled. Besides, he was always bad at lying. Since he was a child. The police officers re-entered the house. They took the pot of clam chowder as evidence and questioned the 2 women. Afterward, they explained the detailed plan of the crime. The poison mixed into the clam chowder was, as Carol had suspected, a special drug stolen from a hospital. It was lethal even in small amounts and difficult to detect. James had obtained this drug with Rebecca's help. And to create a perfect alibi, he had planned to have Carol at the same meal. According to his plan, would take 1 bite of the soup, suddenly feel ill, and die a few hours later, Melissa said in a trembling voice. And then he would play the role of the grieving husband and collect the insurance money. Carol squeezed her hand firmly. But he failed. Thanks to your intuition and courage. The 2 women looked at each other in silence, then embraced. Feelings of relief that this nightmare-like night was coming to an end and anxiety about the new life ahead intermingled in their hearts. The heavy wooden door of the Massachusetts Supreme Court opened, and Melissa entered with her lawyer, Sarah Cohen. Dressed in a cream-colored suit, she exuded a strength that no longer showed any trace of her previous shadow. Carol followed behind her, and the 2 took seats on the prosecution side. The trial had been going on for 2 weeks. The prosecution methodically presented carefully collected evidence, revealing James's criminal plan. However, James's lawyer skillfully argued for insufficient evidence. It's all circumstantial evidence. There is no direct evidence anywhere that my client put poison in the soup, argued Martin Bradshaw, James's lawyer, dressed in a gray suit, eloquently in court. And my client consistently maintains his innocence. This is nothing more than a nightmare created by Mrs. Melissa Watson's imagination. At those words, Melissa clenched her fist even tighter. James sat in the defendant's seat, maintaining a completely expressionless face. His eyes avoided Melissa and Carol, staring only straight ahead. "Prosecution, do you have a rebuttal?" asked Judge Helen Sutton. Her sharp eyes had the power to distinguish truth from falsehood, from years of experience. "Yes, we do," said Prosecutor Robert Miller as he stood up. "Today, I call our final witness, Mrs. Carol Watson." As silence fell over the courtroom, Carol slowly made her way to the witness stand. Her steps were quiet, but her eyes held unwavering determination. "Mrs. Carol, how many years did you work as a nurse?" 42 years. Carol's voice was calm. "And during that time, you gained deep knowledge about poisons and dangerous drugs?" "Yes. I worked in the emergency department for 20 years and dealt with various cases of drug poisoning." "And what judgment did you make about the soup that the defendant, your son James, served to Melissa on the day of the incident?" Carol took a deep breath and answered. "I felt something was wrong from my son's unnatural behavior. It was unusual for him to cook in the first place, and furthermore, his nervous demeanor, his attentiveness to Melissa's reaction, all were warning signs." "Did you test the soup?" "No. I didn't taste the soup. However, from my professional knowledge, the subtle oil film on the surface of the soup and its distinctive smell indicated the possibility that a didaroxin-type drug had been mixed in." "Could you explain about didaroxin to the court?" "It's a powerful poison that acts on the heart. Even a small amount can cause a heart attack and make it look like a natural death. It was a strictly controlled drug at the hospital where I worked." A small murmur arose in the courtroom. "And what were the results of the police forensic analysis?" "Traces of didaroxin were detected in the soup, at a concentration of about twice the lethal dose." James's face twisted for a moment. "Additionally, we have decisive evidence that we collected," Carol said quietly. "That my son wasn't thinking about me." "What do you mean?" "He hadn't anticipated that Melissa and I would eat the same soup. If I had eaten it too, there would have been a risk of exposing his plan." The moment he shouted, "Don't eat it," to me, everything became clear. The courtroom fell silent again. "There's one more piece of evidence I have." Carol took a small recorder from her inner pocket. "This is a recording I made 3 days before the incident when I met with a colleague from the hospital." The prosecutor sought permission from the judge and played the recording. From the tape, clearly James's voice flowed. "Oh, Mom. I'm fine. Things are going well with Melissa. But work is tough. Yes, I'm planning a special dinner for the weekend. I think Melissa will be happy." Next, Carol's voice. "That sounds wonderful. What are you making?" "Clam chowder. Melissa's favorite. It's my grandmother's recipe." "Oh, but Mom, I'll prepare something different for you. This recipe isn't suitable for people with shellfish allergies." "But I don't have any shellfish allergies. I've been eating clam chowder for over 40 years. "Oh, really? I thought. Well, never mind. Then the 3 of us can enjoy it together." The recording ended there. A heavy silence fell over the courtroom. James, the defendant, was planning to provide me with a different dish, because he had no intention of letting me eat the poisoned soup. Carol's voice trembled. In his plan, only Melissa would ingest the poison, and I would be safe. And he was planning to play the role of the grieving husband and son. The defense tried desperately to counter, but Carol's testimony and the existence of the recording clearly demonstrated James's plan. His expression finally crumbled, and he held his head in his hands at the defendant's seat. The final decisive evidence was Rebecca Clark's testimony. Initially arrested on suspicion of being an accomplice, she had agreed to a plea bargain with the prosecution. She testified in court with a trembling voice. "James told me that his marriage was broken. He said he wanted to start a new life with his wife's insurance money." Her testimony revealed that James and Rebecca had conspired to obtain poison and plotted the murder. Rebecca had obtained the drug through a friend who worked at a hospital and given it to James. James stared at Rebecca on the witness stand with cold eyes. The last of his resistance seemed to have crumbled. On the day of the final arguments, the courtroom was filled with spectators. The case had attracted national attention and was being reported as the clam chowder attempted murder case. The prosecution's final argument was concise and clear. The defendant, James Watson, attempted to coldly murder his own wife for financial gain. This was a planned and malicious act. The defense's argument already showed signs of resignation. "My client deeply regrets his actions. He made a temporary error in judgment." The judge gave instructions to the jury, and they entered deliberations. Unexpectedly quickly, after just 2 hours, a verdict was reached. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" "Yes, Your Honor." The lead juror stood up. "On the count of attempted murder against the defendant James Watson, we the jury unanimously find the defendant guilty." As a murmur spread through the courtroom, the judge called for silence. "On the count of insurance fraud, we find the defendant guilty." Melissa and Carol held hands tightly. It was the moment when a long nightmare ended. A week later, the sentencing was delivered. James stood in a gray prison uniform, with his head bowed. He was no longer a confident investment analyst, but just a criminal. "Defendant James Watson, the court sentences you to 15 years for attempted murder and 5 years for insurance fraud, a total of 20 years of actual imprisonment." The courtroom fell silent again at the judge's pronouncement. After the sentencing, Melissa was given the opportunity to make a victim impact statement. She slowly stood up and directly faced her former husband. "James." Her voice was quiet but resonated throughout the courtroom. "You tried to kill me, but instead you ruined your own life. I will continue to live without you, or rather, because you're not here, happily." She paused for a moment and took a deep breath. "I don't hate you. I just won't forget what you did. And from now on, I'll build my life with my own strength." Melissa's words were full of strength and determination. She gave James one last glance and left the courtroom with Carol. A small office building stood in a quiet residential area in the Boston suburbs. A wooden sign reading "Watson Consulting" gleamed in the morning sunlight. "Today's client meeting starts at 10. Melissa Watson stood by the window of the spacious office, coffee in hand, looking at the scenery outside. A year had passed since the incident, and she had changed remarkably. A confident expression, relaxed shoulders, and above all, a quiet strength dwelling in her eyes. "I've prepared all the materials. This presentation should definitely secure the contract." Carol Watson answered from the desk opposite. Her gray hair was elegantly styled, and her business suit further enhanced her dignity. Several months after the trial, Melissa completed the divorce proceedings and acquired all property and insurance contract rights. Then she made a bold decision. She left the marketing company where she had worked for many years and established a consulting company with Carol. Combining Carol's nursing management experience and Melissa's marketing skills, they provided consulting services for healthcare-related companies. Now it had grown into a reputable company in the region. A letter came from prison this morning. Melissa put down her coffee and turned to Carol. "From James?" "Yes." It was filled with words of apology and regret, but... Melissa shrugged. "I won't write back anymore. The past is the past. We're living looking forward." Carol smiled warmly. Their relationship had become deeper and stronger through that incident. They were bound by a bond thicker than blood, beyond the relationship of in-laws. What happened to Rebecca? Carol asked. I heard she moved to New Mexico. No one here would hire her. Rebecca Clark was found not guilty due to insufficient evidence of complicity, but she lost her social credibility and couldn't continue living in Boston. There was a knock on the office door, and Melissa's assistant peeked in. Dr. Blake is here. Show him in. There was a brightness in her voice that had never been there before. The door opened, and a man in a suit entered. Thomas Blake, a 45-year-old pediatrician. He had met Melissa at a medical charity event, and they had been slowly nurturing their relationship. Good morning, Melissa. Carol. He greeted them both warmly. Could you join me for breakfast? I'd like to talk about a new clinic. Melissa smiled and winked at Carol. Of course. She picked up her bag and left the office with Carol. Under the sun, the three began walking toward a new cafe. Trust and truth are everything, Melissa said quietly to Carol. There was no longer a shadow of anxiety in her smile. Meanwhile, inside the New England federal prison, James Watson sat in his cell, staring at his returned letter. Despised by other inmates and with no visitors, he was completely isolated. Looking at the light streaming through the window, he reflected on how foolish his plan had been and how easily his wife and mother had seen through it. Regretting the life he had ruined with his own hands, he despaired at the long prison term that stretched ahead of him.